So, when we're talking about fan furor or reception over a particular unit or mechanic in the Warhammer trilogy, it's important to contextualize who exactly is leaving that feedback. Hardcore fan bases are usually kind of insulated on Reddit or YouTube or forums from the silent majority who might occasionally click on a big news video or trailer, but are otherwise not spending tons of time sharing their disgust or appreciation for one thing or the other. The average casual fan is probably not going to Total War forums to make a discussion post about how Kalita should be a sexier snake lady, or how the Quaddle was the worst thing that happened to southern jungles since the Spanish-Aztec War. It's not true for everybody, obviously. Human beings are not a monolith, but generally speaking, I'd say that's a fairly accurate statement. If you're showing up to videos like this one, if you're leaving long-form feedback or reviews, if you constantly find yourself checking news and discussing the series, you're probably more invested than the average consumer, who will typically look at a new unit, say, that shit looks dope, can't wait to play with it, and then move on to go do something else. Which brings me to today's topic of Soul Grinders, a unit that, like many others in the past, has sparked its own minor controversies, debates, backlashes, whatever word you want to use. These Clinker spawn are massive sentient demon engines bound to a Hellforge in the realms of chaos, and the only way they can escape from their mechanical prison is by reaping enough souls in exchange, and then yeeting themselves back into their traditional demonic form. It's a unit I did not expect to see on launch day, and in fact we're not just getting one version, it appears we'll be getting 4, representing each of the 4 Chaos Gods. As per usual, there are a lot of conflicting viewpoints on its aesthetic, on its importance in the trilogy, and whether it should have even been added in the first place. On one side, we have people saying it just straight up does not fit in a setting like Warhammer Fantasy. It literally looks like a defiler from the 41st millennium. All the forge metal and mechanical contraptions and over-designed ridiculousness makes it look garish and out of place next to the more organic-looking demons and forces of order. And to an extent, they're right. It is a 40k model, and it made its way into fantasy simply through a desire to make demon units playable across settings. You could argue it was a cash grab from Games Workshop, and certainly worked, because, hell, if I can play demons in one setting, sure, I'd love to play them in another. It makes it easier for people to get into both and start expanding their model ranges. But the other side argues that Soul Grinders are a good addition, because they subscribe to the idea that a race of hellish abominations, existing in a realm outside time and space, can and should be able to unleash freakish technology that appears beyond the scope of this traditional fantasy setting. The kind of monster that, when it busts into the material plane, straight up makes people poop their pants because it's so unnatural. And that in a world with engines of the gods, gyro bombers, steam tanks, and golden prosthetic claws that can fire laser beams, perhaps it isn't such a crazy jump in logic or design, particularly when they're rolling alongside juggernauts and skull cannon motorbikes. Demons are supposed to feel out of place. They are not from this world. Of course, those aren't the only two camps on a topic like this one. There are a variety of arguments to be made for and against them, and then there are the people who just don't care one way or the other. The casual player who just wants badass-looking toys to conquer the world with. I, for one, am glad to see that Soul Grinders made it in. I felt legit hype when I saw they made the cut. I think they improved the core roster reveal substantially over what it would have been otherwise. If you disagree, that is perfectly fine. You are well within your rights to think that, and you can make some very logical arguments against their inclusion. But look, that ship has sailed. Soul Grinders are for sure going to be in Warhammer 3. So what I want to do today is talk about their implementation, both from a visual and from a mechanics perspective, and discuss how, in a perfect world, they could be improved to better fit the Warhammer Fantasy aesthetic. Which, to be fair, doesn't really exist. There's no binding visual theme in a setting with space laser dinosaurs, Naruto rats, and barbarian mushroom people, but I think there are a few things Creative Assembly could have done here to make Soul Grinders feel less 40k and more fantasy. And the first would simply be to make it more organic. It's something that Skull Crushers, Blood Crushers, and Juggernaut mounts in general do quite well, balancing that forge metal aspect with mechanical parts, piston tendons, and those smoke-reed ligaments with the beating heart of a living, breathing, organic creature. When you look at a Juggernaut, you can tell it's of demonic origins, obviously. You can tell that molten core and armor plating are wholly unnatural and even unnerving, but it doesn't look like it's something that hails from a futuristic sci-fi battlefield. The Soul Grinder certainly does, and so the clear step to be made with its design is to make it look more demon, less robot, by changing the mechanical legs to something more warp flesh and less warp metal. Think of the Acklay from Felucia in Star Wars, that big-ass bug lizard that tries to chop Obi-Wan in half when they're in the arena on Geonosis. If that was the core blueprint that the legs started with, as part of the demonic entity itself, part of the actual demon, and then the armored bits and a few mechanical pieces were fused into it for additional protection and power, you're immediately looking at a unit that feels more at home in Warhammer Fantasy, because the legs are a part of the demon rather than being a legit defiler war machine from 40,000 years in the future. It's actually a very similar topic to what we've discussed with Stormfiends before, and the approach Games Workshop took in the End Times with their design, and the route Fat Shark took with them in Vermintide 2. GW made Stormfiends look very futuristic, almost like Space Marines. They have full-on power armor, they're very colorful, they're very out there, while Fat Shark kind of dialed that back a bit and leaned more into the ruddy steampunk elements. Still impressive technology, of course, but griming it up, making it look more late 19th century, pistons hissing, smoke belching, cogwheels grinding, something a bit more grounded, meant that the Vermintide team did a pretty fantastic job with the Stormfiends redesign, and personally I think that they fit more in fantasy with that kind of look. That's not to say that I don't like the 40k Stormfiend version. I think those look badass, and I'd be perfectly fine for them to look like that in the final implementation in Warhammer 3, but I think there is something to be said for the more reserved design that Fat Shark took in Vermintide 2. By that same token, a Soul Grinder with organic legs and a few more steampunk bells and whistles would accomplish much the same Uncanny Valley, unholy abomination from the warp type vibe without taking people out of the setting too much, and I think it would have been a better design to go for a more organic type demon. Now, in the source material, there is no such thing as a Soul Grinder of Chaos Undivided. All of them are marked by one of the 4 Chaos Gods, but they're forced into subjugation at the Forge of Souls in exchange for quick reincarnation and the obscene power that comes with their new form. So a coordinate Soul Grinder would be forced to protect the Forge, even against an army of invading Bloodletters. We have the designs for 2 of the 4 so far. The Soul Grinder of Khorne, armed with a Harvester Grapeshot Cannon and sword in its right hand, alongside a mechanical Iron Claw in its left. And we can assume that Harvester Cannon will be more of a mid and close-range suppressive tool, because the Blood God tends to have his demons focus on being beastly in close quarters. We also have the Soul Grinder of Tzeentch, which has been described as possessing overwhelming long-range firepower from CA themselves. Whether that will take the form of magic missiles or eldritch flamethrowers, we don't know yet, but the eye in its right claw makes it clear that it will be shooting energies of some sort out of its palms, and it will have a range focus. So what that tells us is that each of the 4 marked Soul Grinders will have their own playstyle and unique identity, their own approach to warfare, informed by the equipment they bring to battle. Tzeentch will be focused on magical artillery, which makes sense, it's thematic with their lore and their army roster in general, and Khorne will be a hybrid melee monster. Melee focus will probably be the impression that it tries to leave on the battlefield, because Khorne's all about melee. We have not seen what the Slinesh or the Nurgle Soul Grinder will look like yet, but we can make some educated guesses based on what has been revealed and what we know about the tabletop and source material. Harvester Grapeshot Cannon and Iron Claw are the default baseline pieces of equipment, but Soul Grinders can be upgraded in 4 different ways on top of that. Baleful Torrent is an artillery flamethrower, and Warp Gaze is a magic missile that follows the rules of a bolt thrower. The current Tzeentch model could be using either one of these in that right eye in its claw, or even both in Warhammer 3. The eye makes me think it's Warp Gaze. The fact that it's a Tzeentch demon makes me think it will be the Eldritch Flamethrower, and it could very well have both. A bound magic missile, some kind of spell that it can use irrespective of your winds of magic, and a long-range flamethrower attack. It would be very fitting for Tzeentch. The Demon Bone Claw grants a single special attack, resolved at strength 10, the hardest a unit in Warhammer Fantasy can possibly hit, and Phlegm Bombardment gives it a Nurgle catapult that yeets diseased and decaying rocks across the battlefield that explode in a conflagration of pus on the other end. You'll notice there are 4 upgrades, and each could easily be tied to a soul grinder dedicated to a particular god. Which brings us to Slinesh and Nurgle. Remember that in designing each of these units, you don't just have to worry about what equipment they're using, but also their overall stat line and approach to warfare. So in the case of Slinesh, a melee-focused monster with vicious crab claws that is significantly faster than the soul grinders of the other three gods, but more fragile, more AP, designed for more hit-and-run attacks than the prolonged combat of a Khornate one or the resilience of a Nurgle one, would go a long way in differentiating their playstyles past the upgrades themselves. That's how you handle marks. It's not just about the visual design, which is obviously very important in a game like this one. It's also about how you build their playstyle from the ground up, and it starts with statistics. I fully expect the Tzeentch and Khornate versions to have substantially different stat lines and battlefield roles too. So when it comes to Nurgle, the Plague Hulk Defiler from 40k gives us a very good picture of what we should expect going forward. Visually, the body type we've seen for Khorne and Tzeentch will not fly for Nurgle for obvious reasons. The rippling six-pack, the Rocky Balboa biceps, not gonna work when you're talking Nurgle. So take an ugly, fat-ass disease demon, intestines spilling everywhere, and make that the core part of Papa Plague's Soul Grinder. Give him the Phlegm Bombardment style, the regen, the weaker attack stats, but the insane resilience, and we have a unit that will have a unique look and combat role in comparison to the other three, which is exactly what we want. There's nothing wrong with having 4 different versions of a centerpiece unit like this one, as long as they each bring unique content to the table. And from what we've seen so far, it looks like that's the direction CA is headed. Now yes, in a perfect world, all 4 demons would have entirely distinct models, no reusing of assets whatsoever. No copy-pasting the upper torso and legs from the Khorne version to the Tzeentch version, more than just swapping their heads, more than just swapping the arm or the equipment in their right hand. You'd want to see them all look completely distinct. But I am not even remotely worried about a lack of unit variety or diversity in Warhammer 3 at all. There's never been anything approaching the scale and scope of Warhammer 3's combined campaign and unit rosters, ever. If Soul Grinders were literally just recolors, as in the same unit 4 times over, with no visual or equipment differences whatsoever, that would 100% be worthy of backlash. As it stands now though, especially with Nurgle not being able to look yoked out of its mind like the former 2, the fact that it will have to be a fat, diseased freak, means we're in a pretty damn solid scenario when it comes to marked units and how CA is planning on handling Soul Grinders. But the other question is, how ubiquitous will these creatures be in the final game? Like I said at the beginning, a lot of people feel like the Soul Grinder is an eyesore that feels entirely out of place here. They don't want to fight against them, they don't want to see them. How does CA handle that? Well, there are a couple ways, but from its stat line on the tabletop and its fearsome reputation in the source material, this will likely be a tier 5 rare unit. You probably won't see it until the latter stages of your Mortal Empires playthrough. It's going to be a fast, hard-hitting, versatile unit, able to fire while advancing, with a powerful armor save, and generally just very difficult to bring down. Pretty much the perfect Doomstack type of unit if you're into that sort of thing. The question I have here, is Creative Assembly going to do anything to curb Doomstacking in Warhammer 3? Do they even feel like it's a problem in the first place? From my perspective, I think players should be able to play how they want, when they want, whenever they want, and if that means fielding 19 Tzeentchian Soul Grinders spewing flame across the battlefield, they should be able to do that. But the caveat is that in the current iteration of Warhammer 2's campaign, that isn't one of many viable options. The game actively encourages you to do it every single step of the way. And as we've discussed previously, gamers will optimize the fun out of any game if developers let them. And so when you spam 19 Soul Grinders, or 19 Bloodthirsters, or 19 Rogue Idols, or what have you, I think that can be fun. I think that can be enjoyable to an extent, but you are taking some of the strategy out of the game when you do that. You are taking some of the fun, the micro, the battlefield tactics out of the game because how you play no longer matters. You can throw them into any scenario and they will come out on top, usually with minimal losses. So, in my opinion, it's up to Creative Assembly to change some of the systems that so actively encourage Doomstacking, like supply lines being one of the big offenders, and tweak them so that players don't feel like spamming single entities or elite tier range troops is the clear and away best strategy for every single campaign. Again, people should be able to spam 19 Soul Grinders if they want to do that. It just shouldn't be the obvious go-to strat that's clearly better than everything, no matter the circumstances. And I do think CA will make some changes in Game 3 that will move some players outside their comfort zone on that front and get them fielding more diverse armies with mid and lower tier troops viable and necessary throughout your playthrough. We'll talk more about that soon. I think that's going to be a really important aspect of Warhammer 3, not just to curb doom stacking in and of itself, but to encourage players to experiment outside of that, you know? I think that's going to be a really core component of how to improve the Warhammer 3 experience. So, again, we'll talk about that more in another video very soon. Let me know what you all think of the Soul Grinder debate, where you stand on it, how you would like the remaining 2 versions to be designed, and I will see you all in the next video. Indy Pride, signing out for now. Have a good one, guys.